The wind in that country didn't just blow, it told lies. Joshua McCord knew that. For 3 years it had been his only company, whispering promises of rain that never came, and stories of travelers who were never there. 3 years since he'd buried his wife, Evelyn. 3 years since he'd buried his own voice right alongside her. He'd chosen silence over whiskey, emptiness over words. It was a cold comfort, but it was his. He was riding the old telegraph track, the poles stripped bare, the wires long since gone to rust. His shadow stretched out long and thin on the frozen dirt, the only thing that moved for miles. The sun was a pale, worn-out coin in the sky. It was a land of ghosts, and that's when he saw them. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks, that the lying wind had finally conjured something real. Huddled under the collapsed awning of the abandoned Red Bluff station were figures, 6 of them, a woman and 5 children clinging together like a knot of driftwood the tide had forgotten. They were so still, so grey against the grey landscape, he figured they had to be spirits, the kind that haunt lonely places and break lonely men. Then the youngest one coughed, a small dry sound that was so painfully human it cut right through the wind's lies. Josh pulled his horse to a stop. He wasn't a man given to second thoughts. Duty was all he had left, a simple straight line he walked from sunup to sundown. But this was a detour he hadn't planned on. The family hadn't moved. The oldest boy, maybe 10 years old, stood slightly in front of the others, his shoulders squared like he could shield them from the world with his own small body. He was shivering, but his gaze was hard. The woman sat motionless. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and one arm was wrapped in a cloth stained with something dark, blood. Her face was bone white, beautiful in a way that spoke of having survived too much. When Josh dismounted, his boots crunching on the icy ground, she finally looked up. Her eyes were the color of the winter sky, empty but with a storm brewing deep inside. She got to her feet, swaying for a moment, pressing a hand to her ribs as if holding herself together. Her voice was barely a whisper, frayed by cold and hunger. "We'll move along. Didn't mean to trespass." Josh stopped a few paces away, his breath pluming in the air. He didn't ask the usual questions. He didn't care where they came from. The answer was written all over them, from nowhere good. He just looked at the blood on her arm, the cracked lips of the little girl hiding behind her skirts, the defiant fear in the oldest boy's eyes. "How long you been here?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse. "4 nights," she whispered. The words seemed to cost her something. He glanced at the horizon. The clouds were turning black, piling up over the ridge. A storm was coming, a bad one. He knew the signs, the way the air got heavy and still, the way the light died. "You'll freeze," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. "We'll manage," she said, but her dignity was as thin as her coat. Her knees were trembling. "I can work. I'll do anything. Just for them." He looked past her, at the 5 small faces watching him. He saw hunger. He saw fear. But he also saw a flicker of something else in the oldest boy. A dangerous spark of pride. Josh knew that look. It was the kind of pride that got a man killed. He remembered Evelyn telling him that duty was a kind of love. He hadn't understood it then. He was starting to now. He took a step closer. His next words were simple, final. "You're coming with me." The woman, Hetty, just blinked. She stared as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "Sir?" "Storm's an hour out," he said, turning toward his wagon. "Load the young ones." But the oldest boy stepped forward. "We ain't beggars." Josh stopped. He turned and met the boy's stare. It was like looking at a wolf cub, all teeth and fire, cornered and ready to fight an enemy 100 times its size. Josh's gaze didn't soften. It just held. Didn't say you were, he said, and for the first time in 3 years he felt a crack in the ice around his heart. Because as he looked at that boy, he saw more than just pride. He saw a secret the boy was willing to die to protect. And Josh had a sudden, terrible feeling that by bringing this family home, he wasn't just saving them from a storm, he was riding directly into one. The wagon was loaded in silence. The children were too weak to make a sound, their small bodies little more than bundles of rags. Hetty hesitated before climbing up. When Josh offered his hand, she flinched, a quick, sharp movement, as if she expected a blow. Then, slowly, she took it. Her palm was like a block of ice. Her hand trembled in his. He helped her onto the seat, careful of her injured arm. As he took the reins, he heard the youngest, a little girl, whisper to her mother, "Is he an angel, Mama?" Hetty shook her head, her eyes fixed on Josh's broad back. "No, baby," she said, her voice so low he barely heard it. "Just a man." But there was a strange note in her voice, a mix of hope and something else, something that sounded a lot like fear. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels cracking against the frozen earth. The sound echoed the splintering of Josh's quiet life. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but his mind was racing. The way she'd flinched, the blood on her arm, the oldest boy's hostile stare. These weren't just signs of hardship. They were pieces of a puzzle, and Josh felt like he was missing the most important one. The miles stretched on under a sky the color of a bruise. Snow began to fall, tiny flakes at first, then thick, heavy curtains that blotted out the world. The children huddled together in the back, their breaths shallow. Hetty sat ramrod straight beside him, fighting off sleep, her jaw set. Every bump in the road seemed to send a jolt of pain through her, but she never made a sound. She was a woman holding herself together with sheer will. Just as dusk began to bleed into night, they crested a hill. There below, nestled in a hollow of cedar and rock, was his ranch. Smoke curled from the chimney. A single light burned in the window. The sight of it made Hetty's breath catch in her throat. It was the first sign of a warm hearth she'd seen in weeks, or maybe years. Josh pulled the wagon to a stop. He swung down and lifted each child out, one by one, their small bodies weighing almost nothing in his arms. When he offered his hand to Hetty, she took it without flinching this time. But as her feet touched the ground, she swayed, and he had to catch her, his arm firm around her waist. "You don't have to do this," she murmured, her face pale in the falling snow. "Maybe I do," he said, his voice low. "Don't matter why." He led them inside. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and old tobacco, and the lingering scent of his wife, Evelyn. It was a smell he knew better than his own. The fire had burned down to embers. He knelt, struck a match, and fed it kindling. As the flames licked the wood, golden light spread across the room, pushing back the shadows. Hetty stood frozen by the door, the children clustered around her like chicks around a hen. It was only when the warmth of the fire finally reached them that they seemed to unthaw. They crept closer, their eyes wide, holding their hands out to the heat. Hetty sank to her knees beside them, her shoulders finally starting to slump. Josh put a loaf of bread and a piece of jerky on the table. The oldest boy, Samuel, watched his every move, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He didn't touch the food until his mother gave a small, weary nod. Later, after the children had eaten and fallen asleep in a heap of blankets by the fire, Hetty found Josh outside. He was stacking firewood, the rhythmic thud of the logs the only sound besides the wind. "We'll go," she said, her voice stronger now. "Once the snow clears." He didn't stop working. "Roads will be worse after the snow," he said, not looking at her. You'll stay till spring. She stared at his back. He said it so simply, like it was an obvious fact, not an act of charity that would set every tongue in the county wagging. People will talk. Let 'em, he muttered. Been talking about me for years. That night, the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Hetty lay awake, listening to the storm and the steady breathing of her children. At some point, she must have drifted off, because she woke with a start to find another blanket laid over her. It was coarse wool and smelled of cedar and the cold night air. It smelled of him. She looked toward the door. Through the frosted window pane, she could see him. He was still outside, chopping wood under the stark light of the moon, his breath fogging in front of him. He moved with a relentless, steady rhythm, as if he were trying to build a fortress against the storm, against the world. He looked less like a man and more like a part of the mountain itself, immovable, solitary, carrying a weight she couldn't possibly understand. But as she watched, she saw him pause. He stopped, the axe resting on the block, and slowly turned his head. He looked directly at the window, directly at her. Their eyes met across the snowy darkness. It was only for a second, but in that moment, she felt a jolt of pure, undiluted fear. It wasn't the look of a savior. It was the look of a man who knew what it was to be haunted. And she realized with a sickening certainty that he wasn't just giving them shelter. He was looking for something, and he thought he might find it in her. Morning came, and with it the news. Word traveled fast in that part of the country, carried on the wind from one lonely ranch to the next. By the time the snow stopped, the whole county knew that the silent widower, Joshua McCord, had taken in a stray, a woman with 5 children and a past as mysterious as the dark side of the moon. Down at the mercantile, the men made jokes. They said old Josh had finally gone soft, that a pretty face had broken the spell of his grief. The women whispered behind their hands, speculating that the widow, they'd already decided she was a widow, must have bewitched him. Only Tom Riggins, the blacksmith, a man whose hands were as calloused as his judgment was clear, shook his head. Ain't softness, he grumbled to anyone who would listen. It's decency, a thing most of you have forgotten the shape of. Back at the ranch, Hetty worked like a woman possessed. She scrubbed the floors until her knuckles were raw, mended the curtains with scraps torn from her own petticoat, and filled the cabin with a quiet, desperate purpose. She was trying to earn her keep, to build a wall of usefulness between herself and the debt she owed the silent man who watched her every move. The children, sensing the fragile peace, began to thaw. Their laughter, at first tentative and strange, started to fill the corners of the cabin, bright sounds in a place that had been silent for too long. Josh worked outside, mending the corral fence, his shoulders turned to the cabin. He pretended not to hear the laughter, pretended not to notice the smell of stew that now greeted him at the end of the day, pretended not to see the way Hetty's haunted eyes sometimes followed him, but he felt it all. He felt the house slowly turning back into a home, and it terrified him. One afternoon, the youngest girl, Lydia, toddled out to the corral where he was working. Her small hand was clutched around a fistful of crushed wildflowers. She held them up to him. "Mama said to give you these," she whispered, her voice as shy as a field mouse, "for bringing us home." Josh froze. He stared down at the pathetic little bouquet. He looked at the girl's hopeful face. Slowly, he reached out and took the flowers. His rough, calloused hand closed around the tiny stems, and a feeling so sharp and painful pierced through his armor that he couldn't breathe. It felt too much like the ghost of a memory, of another small hand, another fistful of flowers. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, then turned back to his work, his movements stiff and clumsy. From the doorway, Hetty watched. She saw the tremor in his hand as he pocketed the flowers, and for the first time, she saw not just a hard, silent man, but a man drowning in a grief so deep he'd forgotten how to swim. And it was in that moment that she understood the look in his eyes from the night before. He wasn't looking for a secret in her. He was looking for a ghost in himself. That night, she couldn't sleep. The fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the children slept soundly, their bellies full for the first time in memory. Josh was outside, as always, chopping wood. The steady, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the axe was the ranch's heartbeat. She found herself listening for it, a sound that meant he was there, a silent guardian in the darkness. She felt a strange ache in her chest, the painful thawing of a heart she thought had frozen solid long ago. She rose from her blankets and went to the window. She watched him work, his powerful shoulders moving with an easy grace. He was building more than just a woodpile. He was building a wall against the world. He stopped suddenly, as if he could feel her eyes on him. He straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, and looked toward the cabin. Their eyes met again through the glass. This time, there was no fear. There was just a shared understanding of loneliness, a silent acknowledgement of the ghosts they both carried. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He turned back to his work, swinging the axe with renewed purpose. Hetty pressed her hand against the cold glass. She had come here expecting nothing but a temporary reprieve from starvation, a place to rest before running again. But now, she realized with a jolt that she no longer felt like she was running. Somewhere between his silence and his kindness, she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. But her past had long claws, and as she stood there, watching the man who had saved her, she saw a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods, just beyond the ring of moonlight. A shadow, detaching itself from the other shadows. Someone was out there, watching the ranch, watching them. Her blood ran cold. The fragile sense of safety shattered into 1,000 pieces. The storm they had outrun was not a storm of snow and wind. It was a storm of men. And it was still coming for her. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if it were afraid to show its face. The snow melted in dirty patches, revealing a world of mud and pale new grass. At the McCord Ranch, life settled into a tense rhythm. Josh worked from dawn till dusk, his silence a shield. Hetty ran the house with a quiet efficiency, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line, searching for the shadow she had seen that night. The children's laughter was louder now, but Hetty couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time. The question hung in the air between her and Josh, unspoken but as real as the newly forged fence posts. How long before the world comes knocking? The knock came on a Tuesday morning. The air was soft, smelling of damp earth and new beginnings. But the rider who crested the ridge brought an ending with him. It was Deputy Colt Tanner. He rode a big bay horse, and his badge glinted in the morning sun, a cold, hard star. Josh met him at the gate. He didn't offer a greeting. He just waited, his hands loose at his sides, his face carved from stone. Tanner didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of authority. "Josh, town's been talking, getting louder." Josh said nothing. He just stared at the deputy, his eyes narrowed. Tanner shifted in his saddle. "Talk about this woman you've got here. Hetty Harland. Seems her husband, Eli Harland, was wanted. Robbed a payroll train out near Abilene a few months back. Got himself killed running from the posse." He paused, letting the words sink in. "They never found the money." The wind died. The world seemed to go still and silent. "Now folks are saying maybe Eli told his wife where he stashed it," Tanner continued, his eyes fixed on Josh's face. "They're saying maybe she's not just a poor widow. Maybe she's a partner." Josh's jaw tightened. He could feel Hetty's presence behind him, standing in the cabin doorway, listening. He could feel her fear reaching out to him across the yard. "That's just talk," Josh said, his voice flat. "For now," Tanner said, "but the railroad company has put up a reward. Not just for the money, but for anyone who helped Eli. A lot of men around here could use that kind of coin." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm just giving you a friendly warning, Josh. Harboring a criminal's accomplice, that's a serious crime. You're a respected man. Don't throw that away for a woman you barely know." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more of a threat than a courtesy, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and suspicion hanging in the air. Josh turned and walked back to the cabin. Hetty was standing just inside the door, her face as white as a sheet. She was wringing her hands, her knuckles white. "It's true," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Everything he said about Eli, it's true." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "But not the other part. I never saw a single dollar of that money. I didn't know what he'd done until the posse came. But no one believed me then. And they won't believe me now." Her shoulders began to shake. "I'll pack our things. We'll be gone by nightfall. I won't bring this trouble to your door." Josh just stood there, his face unreadable. He looked past her, at the children playing by the fire, their faces innocent of the storm gathering around them. He thought of the deputy's cold eyes, the greed disguised as concern. He thought of the shadow in the woods. "Where would you go?" he asked, his voice rough. "Anywhere," she cried, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her face. "Away from here. Better to be hungry and running than to be the reason they spit when they say your name." He took a step closer. His eyes weren't kind. They were hard, forged in a fire she couldn't imagine. "You think I care what they call me?" "I think you care about honor," she shot back, her voice laced with bitterness, "and I've got none left." He reached out and grabbed his hat from the peg by the door. He didn't look at her. He looked at the fire. "You got 5 children who think this is home. You got a son who looks at you like you're the only thing holding the world together. That's honor enough." He turned to face her, his gaze pinning her in place. "The deputy's wrong about one thing. You ain't a partner, but you are an accomplice." Hetty flinched, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. "What? What do you mean?" Josh's voice dropped to a low growl. "You're an accomplice to him getting himself killed. He ran because he had you and them to run for. He made a choice. Now I'm making mine." He settled the hat on his head. "If they come for you," he said, his voice as final as a nail being driven into a coffin, "they'll have to come through me." Hetty's knees buckled. She sank to the floor, covering her face with her hands, her body racked with sobs. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the terrifying, earth-shattering shock of being defended, of being seen. No one had ever stood for her, not once. "Why?" she whispered through her hands. "Why would you risk everything for us?" Josh looked down at her, and for a fleeting second, the hardness in his eyes softened, replaced by a deep, ancient sorrow. "Because some holes are too deep to fill with dirt," he said quietly. "You can only fill them with living." He walked out the door, leaving her on the floor. But he hadn't just made a promise. He had drawn a line in the sand. And he knew, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his bones, that someone was about to cross it. The real trouble wasn't coming from town. It was already here, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the dark. That night, the sky broke open. Rain came down in sheets, turning the ranch yard into a sea of mud. Thunder rattled the cabin windows, and lightning bleached the world white for seconds at a time. Josh and Samuel, Hetty's oldest, were trying to get the last of the horses into the barn when a bolt of lightning struck the ridge behind them. So close, the air sizzled and the ground shook. Then came another flash, brighter and closer than all the rest. It wasn't lightning. It was an explosion of light from the barn itself, a sound like a giant hammer hitting a giant anvil. The roof of the barn, old and dry as tinder, erupted in a tower of orange flame. "It's not lightning," Josh roared over the storm, shoving Samuel back toward the safety of the cabin. "That was deliberate. Someone threw a lantern." He didn't wait for an answer. He plunged into the inferno. The heat was a physical blow, sucking the air from his lungs. The horses were screaming, their eyes wild with terror, kicking at the stall doors. Smoke billowed out, thick and black and choking. "Get back!" Hetty screamed from the cabin doorway, her face a mask of horror. But her voice was lost in the roar of the fire and the storm. Inside, Josh worked with a desperate, focused fury. He threw open the first stall, slapping the horse on its rump, driving it out into the rain. Then the next, and the next. The smoke was so thick he couldn't see, navigating by memory and the terrified sounds of the animals. His hands were raw, his hair singed. A burning beam crashed down, missing him by inches. He was at the last stall when he heard his name, a scream that cut through the chaos. Hetty. She had run into the barn's gaping doorway, trying to heave a fallen timber out of the way, her small frame straining against the impossible weight. "Get out of here!" he bellowed, staggering toward her, his lungs on fire. "Not without you!" she screamed back, her face streaked with soot and tears. He reached her side, and together they put their shoulders to the beam. The fire licked at their clothes. The heat was unbearable. For a moment it wouldn't budge. Then, with a final agonizing heave, it shifted. The main support beam above them groaned, a terrible final sound. The whole structure was coming down. Josh didn't think. He acted. He wrapped an arm around Hetty's waist, lifted her clean off her feet, and threw her with all his strength toward the opening. She tumbled out into the mud as the roof of the barn collapsed behind him in a shower of sparks and thunder. He dove after her, landing hard, the force of the collapse pushing him forward. They lay there in the mud and the rain, gasping for air as the last of the barn fell in on itself, sending a column of fire and smoke into the stormy sky. The sparks rose toward the heavens like 1,000 angry souls. Hetty scrambled to her knees, clutching at his burned shirt. "You fool," she gasped, coughing. "You absolute fool. You could have died." Josh lay on his back, the cold rain washing the soot from his face. His chest heaved. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. He looked at the fiery ruin of his barn, at the terrified horses huddled in the far corner of the corral, at the woman kneeling over him, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. "Yeah," he coughed, a raw, painful sound. "But I would have died doing something that mattered." He saw the look on her face change. The fear and anger were replaced by something else, something deep and powerful. And in that moment, under the raging sky, surrounded by the ruins of his life, Joshua McCord realized he wasn't just fighting for her anymore. He was fighting for himself. But as he stared into the heart of the fire, he saw it. For a split second, illuminated by the flames, a figure stood at the edge of the woods. A tall man in a long coat. He was just watching. Then, as quickly as he appeared, he melted back into the trees. It wasn't the deputy. It was a stranger. And Josh knew with chilling certainty that this fire wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war. And the battle for the McCord Ranch had just begun. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The barn was a smoldering skeleton against the morning light, the air thick with the smell of charred wood and wet ash. But the horses were alive, and so were they. And then the riders came. It seemed like half the town rode out, drawn by the glow that had lit up the night sky. They came on horseback and in wagons, their faces a mixture of curiosity and grim satisfaction. They had come to see the righteous downfall of the man who had taken in a thief's wife. They had come to judge. Josh stood at the gate to meet them. His shirt was burned, his hands were wrapped in makeshift bandages Hetty had torn from her dress, and his face was smeared with soot. Hetty stood a few paces behind him, her hair a tangled mess, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. They stood together, a silent, unmovable wall. The crowd fell silent as they took in the scene. The ruin of the barn, the exhausted couple standing guard, the 5 small children peering out from the cabin door. No one knew what to say. The story they had told themselves of a foolish man bewitched by a wicked woman didn't fit with the reality of the devastation before them. Then Tom Riggins, the blacksmith, swung down from his horse. He walked forward, his heavy boots sinking into the mud. He stopped in front of Josh and slowly, deliberately, removed his hat. "Reckon we heard the story wrong," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the yard. He turned to face the crowd, his eyes sweeping over them, his expression one of deep disappointment. "This woman didn't bring trouble here. Trouble came looking for her. And this man," he said, gesturing with his hat toward Josh, "this man didn't run from it. He stood his ground. He saved every horse he owns from a fire that would have sent most of you cowards running for the hills." A murmur went through the crowd. Faces that had been hard with judgment began to soften with shame. A woman at the back mumbled an apology. Someone else pushed forward, offering a loaf of bread. Josh didn't say a word. He just stood there, his gaze steady, letting their shame wash over them. He hadn't asked for their help, and he didn't need their pity. But as he watched, something shifted. The crowd of spectators became a gathering of neighbors. By midday, the yard was full of people. The men, led by Tom Riggins, were already clearing the debris, assessing the damage, and making plans to rebuild. The women had descended on the cabin, bringing food and blankets, fussing over the children, and murmuring words of comfort to Hetty. The poison of gossip had been burned away in the fire, leaving behind the clean, hard truth of what had happened. As dusk settled, the last of the wagons rolled away, leaving behind stacks of fresh lumber and the promise of more help to come. The world was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't empty anymore. Josh stood by the new posts they had raised for the barn's frame, his back aching, his bandaged hands throbbing. Hetty came and stood beside him, the amber light of the sunset catching in her hair. "You didn't have to keep us," she said softly. Josh turned to her. His eyes were weary, but the deep sorrow in them had been replaced by a quiet fire. "Maybe not," he said, "but I wanted to." She searched his face, looking for any hint of doubt, and found none. Her voice trembled. "I don't have anything left to offer you. I'm broken." He looked out at the horizon, where the rolling fields met the darkening sky. "You brought my house back to life," he said simply. "You brought me back to life." He turned back to her. "A home. You offered me a home. That's more than most men ever get." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She took a step closer until she was standing right in front of him. "You are a good man, Joshua McCord." "Just a man," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Tired of being alone." She hesitated for a heartbeat, then reached out and gently touched his burned hand with her fingertips. "Then maybe," she whispered, "it's time neither of us is." And in the golden twilight, surrounded by the ghosts of what they had both lost and the promise of what they could build, he lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. A quiet, desperate, and beautiful recognition. They were two broken halves of a single soul, finally finding each other in the wreckage. But as they stood there, a floorboard creaked on the cabin porch. They broke apart. The oldest boy, Samuel, was standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide with something that looked like terror. He was holding a small, leather-bound journal. "Mama," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I found this, hidden in your things. It was Papa's." He held it out. "I read some of it. The man who started the fire. His name is in here. Silas. It says he was Papa's partner, and it says Papa didn't die." The world tilted on its axis. Hetty stared at the journal, her face draining of all color. Josh looked from the boy to Hetty, then to the dark line of woods beyond the ranch. The man he had seen in the firelight. Silas. Eli Harland wasn't dead, and his partner was here. They hadn't come for the money. They had come for Hetty. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The blood on her arm when he'd found her. It wasn't from hardship, it was from a fight. She hadn't been running from the law. She'd been running from her own husband. The silence that fell was heavier than any storm. Hetty looked at Josh, her eyes filled with a new kind of despair. The lie she had been forced to carry was finally out. "He's not a good man, Josh," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's a monster. He found us a week before you did. He hurt me. He tried to take the children. I fought him off and we ran. I hoped he would think we'd frozen to death." Josh's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The story changed again. This wasn't about stolen money or a dead outlaw. This was about a monster hunting his family, and he, Joshua McCord, had just painted a giant target on his front door. "He won't stop," Hetty choked out. "He'll burn everything to the ground to get us back." Josh looked at the new timbers of the barn, standing like skeletal fingers against the starry sky. He looked at the 5 sleeping children inside the cabin. He looked at the woman he had just kissed, a woman who had been living in a nightmare he couldn't even imagine. He felt no fear. All he felt was a cold, clean rage. "Let him come," Josh said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He thinks this is my ranch. He's about to find out it's my fortress." He turned to Samuel, who was still standing there, trembling but holding his ground. "Son, you did good. Now go inside and stay with your brother and sisters." He then looked at Hetty. "Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." She nodded, grabbing the journal and backing toward the cabin. Her eyes never left his. Josh walked to the lean-to where he kept his tools. He ignored the axes and saws. He reached for the old Winchester rifle he kept wrapped in an oilcloth. He hadn't fired it in 3 years, not since the day Evelyn had gotten sick. He checked the action. It was clean. He found the box of cartridges. They were dry. He moved into the darkness of the yard, becoming just another shadow. He didn't know where they were or how many there were. Silas and her husband Eli. But he knew they were out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. They thought he was just a farmer, a lonely man who had gone soft. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The night was a coiled snake, waiting to strike. Every rustle of leaves, every hoot of an owl sounded like a footstep. Josh moved through the shadows, a ghost on his own land. He circled the cabin, his rifle held ready, his senses on fire. He checked the corral, the horses shifting nervously, their scent thick with fear. He checked the new framework of the barn, a perfect place for an ambush. Nothing. He knew they were playing a waiting game. They wanted to wear him down, to make him sloppy. They thought fear would be their ally. But Josh wasn't afraid. The part of him that knew how to fear had died with Evelyn. What was left was cold, hard, and patient. He settled in behind the half-built wall of the new barn, a spot that gave him a clear view of the cabin and the woods beyond. He laid the rifle on a stack of lumber and waited. The moon climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard. The silence was absolute. Hours passed. His muscles ached, his burned hands throbbed, but he didn't move. He became part of the landscape, as still and silent as the stones. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement near the well, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadow of the trees. It was a man, moving low and fast, heading for the back of the cabin. Josh raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel. The man reached the rear window, the one to the small room where the children slept. He pulled a knife from his belt and began to work at the window latch. Josh's finger tightened on the trigger. He had a clean shot. He could end it right here. But then, a second figure emerged from the woods, taller, broader. This one didn't sneak. He walked with a confident swagger, like he owned the place. He was heading for the front door. It was a coordinated attack, one to distract, one to enter. They wanted the children. Josh had a choice to make: take out the man at the window, and the one at the door would be alerted. Fire at the man at the door, and the one at the window would get inside. It was a perfect trap. And that's when he realized his mistake. He had been so focused on the threat from outside, he'd forgotten the threat from within. The deputy, Colt Tanner. His friendly warning hadn't been friendly at all. It had been a reconnaissance mission. He was sizing up the ranch, sizing up Josh. He was part of it. The lawman and the outlaws all working together. But Josh had an ace up his sleeve. He wasn't as alone as they thought. Before he could fire, a light bloomed in the distance, and another, and another. A line of lanterns bobbing through the trees, coming up the track from town. It was Tom Riggins, and he had brought half the county with him. Men with rifles and shotguns, their faces grim in the lantern light. The two figures outside the cabin froze. The man at the window dropped his knife and melted back into the trees. The man at the door cursed, then turned and ran. Josh didn't fire, he just watched them go. This wasn't over, he knew they'd be back. But tonight the ranch held. Tom Riggins was the first to reach him. "Saw the deputy ride out of town late," the blacksmith said, his voice a low growl. "Figured he wasn't coming out here to wish you well. Thought you might need some neighbors." Josh finally lowered the rifle. He looked at the ring of determined faces lit by the lanterns. These were the same men who had come to gawk and judge him just that morning. Now they were standing shoulder to shoulder with him, ready to fight. "They'll be back," Josh said. "Let 'em," Tom grunted. "We'll be waiting." Inside the cabin, Hetty had heard the commotion. She unbarred the door, her face pale but her eyes steady. She had a cast-iron skillet in her hand, holding it like a weapon. Josh looked at her, at the men surrounding his home, at the light burning in his window. This was no longer just his fight. It was theirs. But as the men took up positions around the ranch, a cold knot formed in Josh's stomach. Eli and Silas had run too easily. It wasn't a retreat. It was a tactical withdrawal. They knew about the armed men now. They wouldn't try a direct assault again. They would try something else. Something smarter. Something more cruel. And then he remembered the journal. Samuel had said his father, Eli, wasn't dead. The journal was the proof. If Eli Harland was alive, then the story Deputy Tanner had told, the story the whole county believed, was a lie. A lie told for a reason. He turned to Hetty. "That journal. I need to see it." She nodded, her expression grim, and went back inside. She returned a moment later with the small, worn book. Josh opened it under the light of Tom's lantern. The handwriting was a scrawl, the entries short and frantic. It was the ranting of a desperate man. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning for one name. Silas. He found it, and the entry made his blood run cold. "Silas is mad. Thinks I cheated him. Thinks the woman knows where it's hid. It ain't about the money no more. It's about his pride. He says he'll burn the whole world down to get her back, just to prove he can. He's got the law in his pocket, a deputy named Tanner. They plan to get rid of me, take the money and the woman. And then, the last entry, dated just a week ago. She got away, ran with the children. I'll find her. She belongs to me. If I can't have her, no one will. I left my mark on her so she won't forget." Josh looked up from the journal, his eyes finding Hetty's. He looked at the faint scar on her arm, now visible in the lantern light. It wasn't a scar, it was a brand. The letter E. For Eli. This was never about a payroll robbery. That was just a cover story. A lie cooked up by Tanner to turn the county against Hetty. This was about possession. About a monster who saw his family as property. And the final chilling piece fell into place. Silas wasn't the leader. Eli was. Eli Harland, the supposedly dead husband, was alive. He was the man in the long coat. He was the one pulling the strings. And he had branded his wife like cattle. The rage that filled Joshua McCord was a pure, white-hot fire. It burned away the last of his grief, the last of his silence. He closed the journal. "Tom," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "they aren't coming back for the cabin. They're going for the town." Tom Riggins looked confused. "The town? Why?" "Leverage," Josh said, his eyes scanning the darkness. "They know you're all here. They know the town is empty. They'll take a hostage. Someone important. And then they'll trade." A dawning horror spread across the blacksmith's face. My daughter, he whispered. Mary, she's watching the smithy. Josh didn't waste a second. Take your men. Ride back now, fast. The men scrambled for their horses, their faces a mixture of fear and fury. In minutes, the ranch was quiet again. It was just Josh and Hetty, standing alone in the moonlight. It was a trap, Hetty breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. They wanted the men here. They wanted us isolated. They made one mistake, Josh said, turning to face her. He reached out and gently touched the brand on her arm. They thought this was a mark of ownership. His gaze was as intense as a physical touch. It's not. It's a mark of a survivor. He handed the journal back to her. Keep the children safe. Where are you going? She asked, her voice trembling. He picked up his rifle. I'm going hunting. He didn't ride. He ran, cutting across the fields, using the darkness as his cloak. He knew a shortcut to town, a treacherous path through the rocks that horses couldn't take. He moved with a speed and silence that would have surprised anyone who knew him. The quiet, grieving farmer was gone. In his place was something older, something harder. A man pushed too far. He arrived at the edge of town and saw he was too late. The blacksmith shop was dark, but the front door was splintered, hanging open like a broken jaw. In the middle of the street, under the pale moonlight, stood Deputy Tanner, Eli Harland, and the man named Silas, and they had Mary Riggins. Silas had a knife to her throat. "This changes nothing, McCord!" Tanner shouted into the darkness, his voice echoing in the empty street. "We still have what we want. You bring us the woman and the kids, and the girl lives. You have until sunrise." Eli Harland stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face. "Tell my Hetty I'm coming to bring her home," he yelled, his voice filled with a sickening possessiveness. Josh watched from the shadows of an alleyway, his rifle feeling heavy in his hands. They had him. They had planned it perfectly. He couldn't risk Mary's life. He would have to give in. But as he watched, he saw something they didn't. A small movement in the darkness behind the blacksmith shop. A fourth man. Someone who had been hiding, waiting. The man stepped into the moonlight. It was the oldest boy, Samuel. He must have stowed away in one of the wagons. He was holding one of his father's old pistols from the journal's secret compartment, the barrel shaking in his small hands. His face was a mask of pure, terrified hatred. He was aiming at his father. Josh had a split second to make an impossible choice. Let the boy shoot and risk him getting shot in return, or cause a diversion and hope he could end it himself. He chose to act. "Tanner!" Josh roared, stepping out of the alley. "Let the girl go. It's me you want." All three men spun to face him. In that moment of distraction, Samuel fired. The shot was wild, kicking up dirt near Eli's feet. But it was enough. Silas flinched, his grip on Mary loosening for just a second. It was all Josh needed. He fired the Winchester. The shot was clean, precise. Silas dropped the knife, clutching his shoulder as he fell back. Mary scrambled away, running toward the sound of the approaching riders. Tom Riggins and his men were coming back. Eli stared at his son, his face contorted with rage. "You little traitor!" he screamed, raising his own pistol to fire at the boy. A second shot rang out, not from Josh's rifle. It came from the doorway of the sheriff's office. Hetty stood there, a shotgun in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Eli Harland stared at her, a look of disbelief on his face, before he crumpled to the ground. Deputy Tanner, seeing it was over, threw his hands in the air. "Don't shoot, I surrender." It was over. The street was suddenly filled with the men from the ranch, their lanterns casting a golden glow on the scene. Tom Riggins swept his daughter into his arms, holding her tight. Josh walked over to Hetty. Her hands were still trembling, but her eyes were clear. She had faced her monster and destroyed him. He gently took the shotgun from her. Their fingers brushed. "It's done," he said softly. "No," she whispered, looking at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's just beginning." The sun rose on a new day. Deputy Tanner was locked in his own jail cell. Silas was being patched up by the doctor, and the body of Eli Harland was covered with a sheet. Justice, swift and final, had come to Red Bluff. Josh and Hetty rode back to the ranch in the first light of dawn, the children safe in a wagon behind them, looked after by a grateful Mary Riggins. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had passed between them. When they arrived, the yard was full of people. But they weren't gawkers anymore. They were neighbors. They had already started rebuilding the barn, the sound of hammers ringing out in the clear morning air. Josh pulled the wagon to a stop and just sat there, taking it all in. He looked at the half-built barn, at the smoke rising from his chimney, at the woman sitting beside him. He looked at her arm, at the ugly brand that was now just a scar, a reminder of a battle she had won. He dismounted and helped her down. They stood together, watching the community that had formed from the ashes of their shared ordeal. A few weeks later, the preacher came through on his circuit. He was surprised when Joshua McCord, a man who hadn't set foot in a church in 3 years, asked him to stay for a while. That evening, Josh and Hetty stood on the porch of the cabin, watching the children chase fireflies in the twilight. The new barn was finished, its fresh pine smelling sweet in the evening air. "The preacher's here," Josh said, his voice quiet. Hetty turned to him. "I know." He took a deep breath. "I was thinking he could perform a service, a wedding." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "If you'll have me." Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of joy. "I'm not the woman you saved at the station, Josh. I'm damaged." He reached out and took her hand. "This whole world is damaged," he said softly. "All we can do is find the pieces that fit. And you," he said, his thumb gently tracing the back of her hand, "you fit." She smiled, a real, brilliant smile that outshone the rising moon. "Then I'll stay," she said, "not because I owe you, but because I choose you." He pulled her close, and in the quiet of the evening, surrounded by the sounds of their children's laughter and the promise of a new life, they sealed their future. They had both been haunted by ghosts, lost in their own silent wilderness. But together they had found their way home. This story shows that sometimes the greatest strength is found not in standing alone, but in finding someone worth standing for. And that even in the harshest winter, a family can bloom from the most unlikely ground. If you were moved by Josh and Hetty's journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories of survival, justice, and the incredible power of the human heart.